Okay, I think that we should get started. Welcome everybody to the last keynote session of ECIR 2021. I am Iadunis from the University of Glasgow and I will be chairing the session. During the session, like in the rest of the conference, you can use the Q&A panel to ask questions, or you can raise your hand if you want to speak. We will also be taking questions from the YouTube Q&A panel. You can also use the chat panel if you want to react to the session. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce our final keynote speaker at ECIR 2021, Professor Ophir Frieder. Ophir is a professor at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., in the United States. He is a member of the Information Retrieval Lab at Georgetown University and is a computer science faculty, very well known and familiar face in the IR community. He is also a prolific IR author. You might have run into him at SIGIR, CIKM, or Tract. In fact, Ophir was a member of the CIKM steering committee for many years and an editorial board member of the IR journal and JZist. Ophir has made numerous research contributions in information retrieval, which have been recognized by his election into the inaugural ACM SIGIR Academy last year. Ophir holds many fellowships, including from the ACM, IEEE, and the National Academy of Inventors. Ophir is also heavily involved in industrial efforts. For example, he is currently the lead science and technology advisor of Aurora, the business forge. He is also the chief scientific officer of Invaryant and is an inventor or co-inventor of numerous US and European patents, including about information retrieval and healthcare systems. Ophir has strong ties in Europe. For example, he is a member of the European Academy of Sciences and Arts. He has also a research position at CNR Pisa in Italy, the organization hosting ECIR this year. Ophir has been focusing for a number of years now on scalable information processing systems with emphasis on health informatics, a topic also covered today in his keynote. Like all of us, Ophir has been looking forward to visit Lucca and enjoying its fantastic dining scenery, and most importantly, trying Lucca's fine selection of wines. Instead, he will be addressing us today from Washington, D.C., but I am sure that there will be other opportunities to meet in Lucca, hopefully soon. Without further ado, please join me in giving Ophir a warm applause and welcoming him to the stage. Ophir, the stage is yours.
Thank you. Let's see if I can share the screen. You can see my screen? Yes, no?
Yes, I can see your screen, perfect.
Okay. Well, and then I'll take it over from here. So let me begin by saying good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're located and when you're watching this video that I'll present right now. When I was asked to give this talk many months ago, I pictured myself standing on a podium in a beautiful historic church that was recommissioned to be a lecture hall for a modern university. All this was going to be in beautiful Lucca, a historic city that's walled, we could have all gotten together, enjoyed, seen the history, enjoyed the culture, not to mention the food and wine that's readily available there. And I thought to myself, what am I going to talk about? But that was many months ago. And I shelved the idea and said, I'll think about it when I had to give a title for the talk. Little did I know that, or did others know, that we would no longer be in Lucca and that everybody will be talking about vaccines. In fact, just today, when I was preparing for this talk, I read that Pfizer and biotech just completed their testing and they found that 100% effectiveness of their drug for 12 to 15-year-olds. So everywhere you look at, all you hear about are vaccines. Who should get the vaccines? Who are the right target? What are the right vaccines? What are the side effects? If you don't hear that, then you hear about where the pandemic is spreading, what its effects are. And if not that, then you hear about the problems of the mental health condition of all of us and many of us who are in isolation or in a quarantine and the effects it has on us. So when it came to thinking of what topic I would talk about, I thought, well, that's what everybody's talking about. So that's what I will talk about as well. The difference is those conditions are predominantly epidemiological or medical in general. And we're computer scientists. And computer scientists view things as computer scientists do. Moreover, we're search people. And therefore, I thought, these problems are actually search problems. What is more of a search problem than taking the patient record, taking healthcare records, and searching and finding similar patients so they'd be able to predict what is the best drug to take for the upcoming or for the current ailment. Another search problem is where are things spiking in the pandemic? What are the resources affected by it? And what do we need to do to address it? And of course, as I worry, as we all do, the effects of isolation on the individual. And hence we have to worry about what are the mental health state and searching for help in mental health. So with that background and that reality, let me turn to today's talk. So we know the world of innovation. Innovation spans from what I define as engineering practice to research. By engineering practice, I illuminate and define it as taking well-known techniques in some unique order and innovating a solution to a problem that you have. You're not necessarily developing any new tools. You're just using well-known tools in a unique manner and solving the problem. At the other end of innovation is pure research, where we come up with new innovative tools to solve the problem. So rather than using strict, old, defined, well-understood mechanisms, we come up with new such mechanisms and we innovate them, and that's research. And with that framework in mind, I'm going to address two different topics in computerized medicine. The first I'm going to focus on is personalized patient care, namely, what is the best for the individual patient? So given a patient and given a known ailment that the patient's been diagnosed, what is the most effective drug that I can give that patient? Can I search for the most effective drug that has the least side effects in order to best treat that individual? I'm also going to focus on the second topic, which is surveillance. Namely, can I find out by monitoring the airwaves and behavior, what is the patient best suited for and how we can detect early detection of conditions and avoid others. So in the personalized patient care on the engineering spectrum, I'm going to talk about an old effort focused on diagnosis and therapeutics of urinary tract infections. And then I'm going to talk about the current era using graph kernel technology, hidden layers, deep learning to improve our prediction mechanism. So initially we talk about the urinary tract infection, and then we're going to talk about today about variety of the one-shot ailments as well as chronic ailments and how we can provide medication to best address those needs. I will then turn to surveillance. Surveillance, I'm going to talk about how can we detect quickly an outbreak of an ailment or just initial ailment or an epidemic or unfortunately where we're facing today, a pandemic. And we're going to try to detect means to give us early warnings and what we can do with those early warnings. But that's for the population. What about for the individual? Can we detect changes in the individual and using those changes forewarn the potential of self-risk? So that will be surveillance for the individual. So with that introduction, let me turn to diagnosis of urinary and tract infections. This is an old effort. You see here the references range from 2008 to 2011. Actually, those are when the references occurred. This is a problem that was started to be addressed in the year 2001. And the reason I talk about this is some things change and hopefully improve, and some things just stay the same and still need to be addressed. So why am I talking about urinary tract infections? In 2002, the American Journal of Medicine reported that according to its readings, UTI accounted for nearly 7 million office visits and 1 million emergency department visits, resulting in 100,000 hospitalizations in the United States. Nearly 1 in 3 women who had at least one episode of UTI requiring antimicrobial therapy by the age of 24. And worse yet, almost half of the women all experienced a UTI during their lifetime. But that was 2002 when it was reported. What about later? In a 2007 study, unfortunately, urinary tract infections are the second most common type of infection in the body, accounting for about 1.8 million visits to the healthcare system each year. And again, for women, the lifetime risk of you having a UTI is greater than 50%. So nothing had changed by 2007. Where are we today? According to today, urinary tract infections are very common in the United States. It is the second most common type of infection in the body, and is a reason for more than 8 million visits to the doctor each year. About 10 in 25 women and 3 in 25 men will have symptoms of UTI during their lifetime. Up to 10% of women have a urinary tract infection in a given year, and half of the women have at least one infection at some point in their life. So over this 20-year period, apparently not much has changed. The way we treat UTIs is basically an outpatient disease processing, and it's basically based on guidelines. A patient goes to a doctor. The doctor examines the patient and says, I believe you have a urinary tract infection. It's a presumption of diagnosis. They presume they know the bacteria, and they use the guidelines which come out every year, which means on average, they're 6 months out of date, to be able to give you a prescription. The problem is, because UTIs are so common, bacterial resistance occurs regularly, and hence the diagnoses are not necessarily right. So could we use, rather than the guidelines, the current information about the patient, namely patient-specific information? So a collaboration with the head of urology at Northwestern began. And what we did was we took his electronic medical records, which were a rarity in that time, and we composed the age, sex, geographical location, occupation, symptoms, and prior prescription use of his patients. And we tried to predict the organism, susceptibility, optimal duration of treatment, outcome, and future guidelines. We used very simple data mining techniques, as computer scientists knew, but we applied it to a problem that was never addressed before. And in fact, we got some initial good results. But we wanted to be able to try a study. And when you have good results and it's early on, you go to investors. You ask investors to invest. And we went through a panel of investors and they said it was simply too futuristic. So we went to the federal government. We tried to get research funding to support our study. But you have to realize that this is June, July 2001. And in the United States, September 11 changed the world. And therefore, the only thing you could get funded in health was basically bioterrorism. So the idea was quickly shelved. No study was conducted, but yet a patent was filed, actually two. And eventually the whole thing was scrapped and forgotten. But time changes nearly everything. As you see, UTIs are still prevalent. But that time that passed meant that electronic medical records were now commonplace and used. And when the patents issued, Northwestern commissioned a study to be able to see what exactly our approach would do for the urinary tract problem. And this study resulted in several guidelines and several approaches based on the mining of the data. And this is just one such example of treatment between nitrofurantoin and cephalosporin. Sorry. As you can see, it is a guidelines of how to act. And when you took it to the patients that he had, the guidelines got approximately a 75.3% efficacy. Our algorithm achieved on patients a 76.7% efficacy. Now, it is statistically significant, but that's not very important. What is important, that if you could employ and deploy this approach on a national scale in the United States, a 1.5% difference in achievement means since each time you misdiagnose a patient, the patient suffers 3 days of discomfort. If you scale it to 8 million visits, you're talking about 360,000 days, or approximately 1,000 years of patient suffering. So a fixing of 1.5% significantly reduces discomfort, let alone the economic impact it does by people not going to work due to ailment. So this was eventually popularized by Northwestern, and we had our initial success, except things change and technology is vastly improved. So now our goal is to build an intelligent medical assistant. By medical assistant, we're not trying to replace the physician. We're trying to help the physician and give the physician a second opinion. This predictive assistant must predict the efficacy of a proposed prescription for a determined ailment for a given patient. Namely, simply put, given a patient, given a diagnosis that the physician has decided, and given a potential medication or treatment to give the individual, give the patient, what is the likelihood that this would succeed, that this medication would cure this patient with minimal side effect? This predictive system must resist high noise, because the human body is not standard and medical records are very noisy. Support high accuracy, because unless it gives you good guidance, no one's going to use it. And since we're talking about using it, the model must provide interpretability. There is no way a medical doctor is going to use anything unless it's interpretable and they can understand why the diagnosis occurs. Now, this is important for the doctor, but in some cases, it's actually law. The European Data Protection Regulation, effective May of 2018, stated that a data subject should have the right not to be subject to a decision based solely on an automated processing, meaning you need interpretation, particularly when it deals with their health and other conditions. So not only is it important for the doctor and important for the patient, it is a matter of law. So we teamed up with several medical doctors and medical professionals and physicians of various types in Taiwan. And we developed a system based on graph kernel prediction for drug prescription. We interacted with Taiwan because Taiwan has a nationalized health service, unlike the United States. And you can actually get a lifelong medical records and a large number of them in order to conduct your study. The typical approach of building any such assistant is to take the raw EHR data, which is highly dimensional and high variance and complex structures and temporal relationships, and encode it into some kind of representation that a computer can process. Once you take this encoding, you can feed it to and train a classifier and eventually give a prediction and test of what your drug is going to do. The traditional method takes a high dimensional EHR data record and creates a bag of words description, an encoding of all the various ailments and medications and so on in the medical record. But the flaw with this is it lacks temporal ordering. So the other option is to take a bag of pattern option, which basically encodes all the treatments and medications and the ailments associated, or vice versa actually, and use a bag of pattern. But this is very computationally difficult. But regardless, whichever approach you take, you feed it into a classifier and it will tell you whether it's the right medication or not. While this is highly interpretable, and that's a very big plus, it lacks a temporal ordering or computational difficulty involved. And because of that, it's simply too simplistic to learn complex features, so its accuracy is poor. So today, we could take a deep learning methods. Again, we could encode the representation. We could train our deep learner, and then we can go and find out whether the drug will work. While this is sufficiently powerful, the problem with it is it lacks interpretability and hence will not be adapted. And more so, it is overfitting because the data patterns are very irregular. So our goal was to try to find a combination of the two, simplistic enough, yet mature enough to be able to accurately predict what the likelihood is that the drug would work for a given patient. We were going to search, given a patient record, to find all other patients that are similar to it or highly similar to it, to him or her, and be able to decide whether this medication would work based on their experience. So here's an example of a medical record, at least just part of a medical record. The collection we obtained came from Taiwan's National Health Insurance Research Database. We got a sample of 1 million sample patients with a 20-year complete medical history for each. And therefore, we had about 200 million clinical records for our study. As you can see, this is only part of it, and it's quite noisy. We took that record and we encoded it into a graph, a patient graph that we could actually understand better and be able to compare these graphs against other patients. Namely, use this search graph, this patient graph as a search graph to find similar patients. But before you do any of that, you have to decide if your treatment is going to be classified as successful or a failure. So based on our doctors who are collaborators, we've defined a observation window prior to the diagnosis, and then an observation window after the diagnosis. And if in the 4 weeks after the observation, after the treatment, there was no reoccurrence of a disease, we viewed that as a success. By we, I mean the medical doctors. If, on the other hand, you had a repeat of the same ailment, the medical doctors viewed that as a failure. So our approach is based on what our medical doctors collaborators told us. So here's a sample graph of a patient. In this case, you have a male who's 71 years of age that was diagnosed with bacterial pneumonia. The patient was given ciprofloxacin, and fortunately, after more than 90 days, no reoccurrence of the disease. So this treatment was viewed as a success. In contrast, here's a 67-year-old female who too was also diagnosed with bacterial pneumonia. She was prescribed that regimen of medication, but unfortunately, 3 days later, she was re-diagnosed with the same condition. We treated her with a new medication, and that was a success eventually. So this was an example of a treatment that was a failure. Using the medical guidance, we found 3 comparative measures that are important for diagnoses to find similar patients. One deals with the temporal order, namely the sequence of ailments and time differences between these conditions. The second medical event dealt with general connectivity, namely what are the events of the medical records, the medical events. And the third was node, and the node generally meant was what is the overlapping between the commonality of patients. And we defined similarity measures to judge each of these. We trained the network, we created the patient graphs, we made a pairing of the nodes, of the pairing of the patients to each other, and we basically fed it through a classifier to determine success or failure of our presumed prescription. Again, using this data set of 1 million sample records, sample patients, 20-year complete history, and 200 clinical visits, we obtained the IRB approval from both Georgetown and the Taiwanese government, and we conducted our study. We chose 4 short-term diseases for our study. By short-term, it means it's a disease that given an early stage treatment of antibiotic, you would be able to cure the disease rapidly. The 4 that we chose were the dominant diseases in the Taiwanese data set, and that is pneumonia, acute otis media, acute cystitis, and urinary tract infections. We compare our suggestive guideline, our suggestive approach against the state of the art, both the deep learners and the linear regression models, and we were significantly more accurate. And we considered this solved. But the problem is that's only short-term ailments, and there are many long-term ailments, and those chronic ailments are very serious. So what about long-term ailments? So the first thing we needed to do was we needed to change our search criteria and our success criteria. The criteria is no longer just a 4-week observation period. We look at the record, we do a 1-year treatment plan, and then we observe for 5 years. This is according to the doctors. What happens is if there's no repeat condition or no chronic condition, severe in that 5-year observation, it is viewed as a success. Otherwise, if there's some severe condition such as a heart attack during that 5-year observation period, it is obviously a failure in treatment. We use our comparison measure to see if we can give the right similarity score, and it turned out that our measure was not sufficiently sensitive for long-term chronic care. So we developed a new sensitivity measure, a new similarity measure. We used cosine, and we found out that this cosine measure did work significantly better, and did achieve the high accuracy we needed. So we were considering dropping the original Euclidean distance measure, but it turned out that Euclidean distance does work better somewhat in the one-shot ailments such as pneumonia, while the long-term care condition, the chronic cases such as diabetes, hyperlipidemia, and hypertension, the cosine measure worked best. So if you're looking for long-term care, you would use our cosine measure, otherwise the Euclidean one. That's nice, I'm showing you numbers. But I began this portion by saying that no doctor is going to use it unless the doctor can interpret what the results are. So how do they interpret it? Well, because it's a search problem, you can look at using the different measures, which are the closest patients to the given patient for the given disease, for the given suggested medication. And if you have the majority of the votes of similar patients, the dominant similar patients, showing a failure, such as in the first case, then the treatment for patient 10 will not be successful and should not be given. In contrast, if the majority of the votes are successful, namely the search found the similar patients given the same kind of medication for the same ailment succeeded, then it's likely to succeed. And hence the doctors can probe into greater detail what the patients look like and what is involved in the treatment and why it's likely or unlikely to succeed. So we were happy. It worked for short-term ailments, it worked for chronic cases, and we declared ourselves mission accomplished. Now, those familiar with history will know that when somebody declares mission accomplished, it usually isn't. So the question is, what does it mean by the mission? So what was the mission? If the mission was an academic problem, we should be happy. After all, academic problems are measured by two items: publications and funding, and we achieved them both, so we were happy. In practice, we had limited success. Doctors were using it in a limited amount. Our collaborators were using it. Hospitals were investigating it. We were happy. But that was very limited, and it was only in Taiwan using the Taiwanese data. So we went in pursuit of impact. And by impact, we looked for reduction to practice. And fortunately, a patent was filed, and a company that does data flow and high performance computing basically licensed it from the UK, called McCellar Technology. It's an international company. And together with them, we developed a system for medical use. So in 2020, McCellar licensed this technology, and their motivation and their press release for licensing the technology was that they recently licensed novel, explainable AI-driven prescription prediction technologies. The reason was to productize scalable, patient-specific prescription selectors, reducing drug resistance, thereby improving the patient care. But licensed technology is only useful if somebody actually implements it and somebody actually uses it. And the first thing that we talked about was the doctors have to feel comfortable with it. So here's a patient graph that demonstrates what a long-term care looks like. The first hypertension diagnosis was in February of 2010. This was a male patient, age of 57. The last hypertension diagnosis was in October of 2021. And from then on, there was no other conditions as such. So this was a successful, and we could verify success. In contrast, this one was a failure. In the first hypertension diagnosis was in 2007. The last hypertension diagnosis during the treatment period was in 2008, less than a year afterwards. Unfortunately, in 2010, this patient suffered a heart attack. So this was a failure. And as you can see, the doctor can understand and probe what are the conditions and what are the ailments in each way, and therefore get an intuitive feel of why a patient looks like what they do. In fact, when the patient comes in, the physician can enter the presumed diagnosis and the patient information, and the patient information immediately shows up, and similar patients can show up as well. Here's the patient graph for the individual involved. When you give the diagnosis of the given ailment, the doctor can suggest a prescription and then press prediction. And then a search to find similar patients are found to be able to predict whether this patient and their patient history is close to another patient with their patient history and what happened when that other patient was given this drug. Unfortunately, this example is a failure. So if it's a failure, you need to know why it's a failure. So you can look at other patients, which are the patient is viewed from all the conditions to be most similar. Or just for similarity in medical events, just focusing on one of the similarity conditions. Or the temporal order. topologically. It doesn't matter what the criteria are. The bottom line is that for a given patient that walks into the treating physician, for a given diagnosis that the physician has given, for a given potential set of treatments the physician wishes to consider, this can predict clinically the likelihood of success or failure of the approach. And obviously the doctor will give the one that's most likely to succeed. So that's personalized care. The technology has evolved over time, but the approach of being able to provide the best care for the individual patient by the physician, by up-to-date information, by similar patient is still the same. So now let me turn over and focus on surveillance. And at first, I'm going to focus on disease outbreak, namely being able to predict when a disease is occurring before standard approaches for doing so. So this is also relatively older work. It was done in order to predict a disease outbreak. So how is public health surveillance done? Public health surveillance is a very time-consuming effort, because what happens is a patient goes to a doctor. The doctor sees the patient, and the patient says, I've got a runny nose, I've got a fever, I've got muscle aches. The physician says, okay, rest, take this medication, come back and see me if this doesn't work. Second patient comes into that same doctor, same conditions. The doctor looks at the patient, says, okay, you have the same conditions, describes the same medication, sends the patient home, says, come back and see me if your condition doesn't improve. Third patient comes in, same story. Eventually, a fourth and fifth. And the physician starts to wonder, this is strange. This is far too many people with the same conditions coming to address with the same ailments. So the physician notifies the CDC. At the same time, other physicians are likewise experiencing the same behavior, and they too notify the CDC. And the CDC says, wow, a lot of patients are coming. It is likely to be an outbreak. But this takes time, and therefore the identification takes a while and it's delayed. Obviously, if we know sooner rather than later, we can treat the condition better. So we are motivated to expedite the information, to expedite the detection. And nowadays, when we talk about information sharing, social media seems to be the answer. So is it the answer for this? We were given a collection of 2 billion tweets collected by Johns Hopkins University over the period of 2009 May to October 2010. It was filtered to about 1.6 million health-related tweets, and then it was partitioned over time, from May 2009 to October 2010 by month. We took those tweets and we cleaned them up. We removed punctuation, we lowercase and tokenized, we did stopword removal, duplicate term removal, and we cleaned up and improved the synonym detection. And these are some tweets. As you can see in these tweets, there is terms that are repeated. So we created a term set, namely, what is the support for a given set of terms in these tweets? So in this case, for example, flu and sore throat appears in 3 tweets. Fever occurs in 3 tweets. Cough in 2. And therefore, the frequent term sets, if we assume a threshold of support of a minimum of 3, are flu, sore throat is 1, and fever is the other. We decided to see which of these term sets are trending. So here are 2 examples. There's the blue line, which, although high in terms of readings, doesn't seem to vary very much. Whereas the red line seems to spike in March and April. And indeed, the blue line is a very common, and it stands for feel sick. But this red line, which does trend in April and May, is talking about allergies and the way they feel. We took those term sets that trend and we use them as search queries against Wikipedia. And the reason being is Wikipedia is comprehensive, including health topics, and is written in layman's English, in which case you would be able to use those terms effectively. We found all those that are retrieved that actually provided an ICD code. An ICD code is a billing code. It's used by the medical profession. And if you have an ICD code in your record entry in Wikipedia, you are probably talking about a medical condition. And indeed, when you did these terms, you found conditions such as sore throat. If you compare what we detected against the CDC, you can see that both curves look relatively the same. You should not worry about the scale. You should worry about the detection. And indeed, in both cases, the spikes matched. So we were feeling fairly comfortable. And we said, wow, social media may be sufficiently accurate. So we did a little further investigation. Indeed, when Scully landed the plane on the Hudson, it was first announced on Twitter, and it was indeed correct. In fact, many people also did flu tweet studies, and they too were correct. And again, a sense of comfort began. And then we looked at Hurricane Sandy predictions and coordination communication. Few research opined that Twitter served as a lifeline of information during Hurricane Sandy. And that's good. However, CNN identified that there were false statements on Twitter, such as plans to shut down all power in Manhattan to flood waters pouring in the New York Stock Exchange, except they weren't. So we weren't as comfortable anymore. But the most heinous example of inaccuracy occurred when Michael Jackson died, which was announced correctly on Twitter. But Twitter decided that why only announce the death of Michael Jackson when you can announce the death of others as well, whether they were alive or not. So one announcement was that Jeff Goldblum was dead. There's an old skit called The Colbert Report. It's very old now, but it's very entertaining, where Stephen Colbert basically talks to Jeff Goldblum from the dead because Twitter announced that Jeff Goldblum was dead. And even though he was alive and well, he must be dead because Twitter announced it. The communication in the skit is very humorous, but it resolves itself when Jeff Goldblum tweets, "I'm alive," and hence it was okay. Obviously, this caused some worry about accuracy. But what did we find? We found that Sinus trended in March and April of 2010. And that made sense because after all, there are lots of people suffering that we know of allergies, and hence they're coughing continuously at that time period, namely like now. That's not a big surprise because it also spiked was allergic response, which again made sense because of hay fever. We were kind of surprised about food allergy when it spiked, but food allergies are actually common in seafood that are eaten around this time frame, or so we were told, and then again felt comfortable. So this was nice, but the question is, does it have any practical value at all? And we found the practicality when we teamed up with Cincinnati Children's Hospital. In the summer of 2014, the endovirus D68 pummeled the Midwest of the United States. Hospitals were caught off guard by the prevalence of this epidemic that occurred. We were just completely caught off guard. In fact, in Children's Cincinnati Hospital on September 10th, 2014, there were 444 cases in the emergency department visits. This is about 1.5 times what it normally is. And this caused significant staffing, space management, supply problems in the hospital. It reduced the capacity to deal with other threats and emergent events. The question was, had they seen this coming, what could they have done to plan adequate staffing coverage and space management? Could they procure the appropriate supplies and drugs? Could they warn vulnerable patient population not to visit So therefore, they'd prevent this potential spread. And immediately the response was they should have seen it coming, because after all, flu is seasonal, or is it? So I plot the rates of visits and hospitalizations during different seasons, 2009 to 2010, 11, and so on and so forth. Each of these lines is a different season. So there is some seasonality. If you look at it between the week 16 and week 40, it never spiked. However, it spiked at different times during different years. So seasonality was not the answer. What about social media? Turns out that Twitter is the ideal forum for this kind of work, and searching Twitter is the ideal result. And the reason being is the demographics for Twitter is between the ages of 18 and 49. Those are the childbearing years. And if a child gets sick, most likely the parent will as well. And if the parent gets sick, most likely the child will as well. Regardless who gets sick first, the parent will talk about it or tweet about it. So monitoring tweets would be the right approach to look at or consider. If you look at the Twitter word cloud for Chicago that time period, you see the dominating words are headache, flu, asthma, coughing, chills. So that was Chicago. Pittsburgh was no different. Chills, headache, flu, sneezing. So we looked at what happened in Cincinnati. We kept only the influenza-like words generating in the Cincinnati area and observed what are their incidents. We covered this period of time, and we made sure that all results were in a 50-mile radius of Cincinnati. Of course, we de-identified the data and got the IRB approval to study it. Based on the 2,700 tweets, about 53% of them had headaches. Flu was in 19%, coughing about 10, and much less lower other words. We did a confidence interval in statistical testing, and we found out that we could predict using flu about 5 days, coughing 4 days, headache 2 days, with quite a high degree of certainty. And the bottom line is with those combinations, we should have been able to predict 2 days ahead of time whether something was spiking and taking precautions for doing it. So Cincinnati Children was armed with another tool for detecting early warnings. Obviously, social media is not necessarily reliable, but it is a guideline and it is an indicator that one should consider. With that and dealing with pharmaceuticals being purchased and the doctors visiting increasing, you should be able, given this guideline, to be able to get an early warning prediction. So that was for the population. So children in Cincinnati Hospital could feel more comfortable about being able to predict things ahead of time. But that's for the general population. What about for the specific population? Can we do the same for the individual? Can we avoid self-harm, or at least reduce the chances? So this is a joint effort by 2 companies, Quantify and Pushed Aura. And it's to surveil and do behavioral study of the individual. And why do we want to do that? Well, the healthcare system, noted above over a 3-year period, indicates how often the patient or the individual went to see a medical practitioner. In contrast, their social media posts are recorded in blue. As you can see, they are far more frequent. This is what's defined and called the healthcare white space. The approach wishes to do the following. We wish to monitor and score the social media interaction of the individual, both in terms of frequency and content. We wish to monitor and score the type and volume of activity over time. We wish to combine these scores and alert the individual as needed if there's a condition that warrants such an alert. So as you can see, behavior changes slightly before there's a suicide attempt. But the vocabulary significantly changes. As you can see, that a predominance was detected. It says, I think it would be best if I weren't here in a way that couldn't annoy anybody. I've been cutting again. So the behavior and the vocabulary are themselves alarming. And this is one indicator. But that's the social media interaction. What about general daily activity? This you can record using a smartphone or any intelligent device, as well as monitoring what is being posted on the computer or the smart device for the social media interaction. If we created a profile by monitoring the top 5 activities, say the person's involved and how long they've been doing it, again, via the individuals opting in, you can detect the location and the duration of their activities, say for work at home during a 24-hour period, varying over the week, again, building a profile. You can determine where they're located over their daily activity. And you can see who they're interacting with based on their communication patterns over a 12-month period, over a 12-hour period. Or of any kind, you can learn any other activities that you wish. All these activities generate a human profile that is likelihood behavior of the individual. This is opt-in information that the user allows you to monitor. And by building this profile, hopefully you can make sure that the individual's behavior doesn't deviate too greatly. This is probably in contrast to, instead of activity, the daily inactivity tracking, where the person becomes a couch potato, doesn't seem to be interacting with anybody, doesn't seem to be eating anything. And this potentially is a cause for alarm. In the United States, the number of people who die in the military between switching after leaving active service to retirement mode, leaving the service, is greater than the number of people that have died in combat in the recent wars. So this is on a yearly basis is a significant problem, and they might wish to opt in. So once it's detected that there's a difference, what do you do about it? Well, you can notify the person that the individual has listed in their contact list. You could tell Nancy Green that you suspect that this person has depression with some level of belief, or that they're sedentary with some other level of belief. Or contact the physical therapist. Maybe they will get them moving again. And when you contact them, you can provide them all the information of what they've been doing in the past 30 days or 7 days or any specified period of time. And you can say that the reason you're notifying them is because they potentially have depression. And you believe this with some medium level of confidence. Now, why are we doing this? Because in the traditional setting, roughly 1 out of 25 people who should get clinical screening actually does get clinical screening. And this quantified system, about 11 out of 25 are detected. Now, I'm not saying, nor are they, that all 11 need treatment, but it's important to give the people who need treatment the treatment they need. And the reason it's important is that early detection potentially saves lives. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't address the elephant in the room. The reason that you're talking, the reason that we're seeing each other online instead of in beautiful Lucca and enjoying all that Lucca has to offer. And that elephant in the room is obviously COVID-19. So I would be remiss without saying something at least on COVID-19. And this is work done in the Georgetown Information Retrieval Lab regarding COVID-19. And I will talk about 2 such projects briefly. The first is a recent patent that issued. And what this does is detecting COVID-19 using surrogates. What it developed was a triage system that determines whether a user is likely to have contracted the disease based on sensor data received from the user device, a common theme for us, namely a smartphone or an activity tracker. And the reason it's important is because direct measurements of symptoms using sensors available to the user may not be feasible or sufficiently accurate. The triage system also uses surrogates to identify certain symptoms. For example, a fever may be detected using heart rate data. A cough or shortness of breath may be identified by analyzing recorded sound. Fatigue using motion detection. And loss of sense of smell or taste using recorded sound and using speech detection algorithms. By recording all these symptoms and evaluating them and using a user-specific threshold function that basically assesses your likelihood based on your background that you have contracted COVID, gives an early warning system to tell you that you are fairly comfortable that you don't have COVID, or you must immediately go get a PCR test because you're highly likely to have contracted COVID. This is only useful if somebody actually does it. And we had our technology licensed for worldwide deployment just recently by a worldwide organization called the Coalition Network. And they're in the process of dealing with deploying it now. The second effort I have nothing to do with, but it deals with COVID search, and it came out of the lab. It was done by a Nazli Goharian, Arman Kohan, who's a former student that basically was at AI2 at the time, and Sean McAvaney. What this dealt with is from the work from the Tract system that basically did as tailoring search engines for retrieving medical literature and answering COVID questions. Simply put, a query was issued and various documents were retrieved and assessed. In this case, what are the initial symptoms of COVID-19 and arathia, which I obviously mispronounced, as initial presentation of COVID-19 observation, or non-epileptic seizures in autonomous dysfunction as an initial symptom of COVID-19, or epidemiological and initial clinical characteristics for patients with family aggregation of COVID-19. In short, this was a successful search engine that basically found documents related to COVID-19. I don't know much about it, and I will leave it at that, but I will point out that you should, for more information, you should read the paper that appeared last year in EMNLP by Sean McAvaney, Arman Kohan, and Nazli Goharian. So what did we talk about? We talked about the scope of innovation from engineering to research. We use that scope to describe how, for a given patient, for a given ailment, for a given potential set of drugs, we can best prescribe that medication so that it'll be most effective and least side effect for the patient. We showed how it was done early on for UTIs. And then we talked about how currently, using modern technology, we can do it for one-shot ailments that are treated with antibiotics, as well as chronic care conditions. We then turned the focus onto surveillance. And surveillance, we talked about disease outbreak and for being able to detect epidemics early, and behavioral health, which is basically making sure that the individual is well taken care of. But before I leave, I want to leave you with food for thought. The big data craze is around us. It's everywhere. And medicine is no different. We can mine personal information, and that's great because we can actually then personalize the treatment. We can monitor and we can surveil the horizon, and that's great because we can forewarn of possible harm, both for the society as a whole and for the individual. And we should declare that to be peace and harmony, or should we? Should we be worrying about it instead? Every day there's yet another data breach. And are there safeguards? Well, for medicine, we are fairly confident it's okay because medical prognoses are safe. Or are they? Consider the following query sequence mining from a given location. For a given IP address, we saw repetitive queries for 3 consecutive days finding breast cancer. For 2 days after that, we found nothing, no related queries. Then the following day, we find tamoxifen and mastectomy. What do you think just happened? Well, we actually know what happened. That individual, or somebody that the individual is searching for, just was diagnosed with breast cancer. But I thought this such a prognosis was protected. Well, it would be if it was considered medical data, but search queries are certainly not medical data. What about behavioral monitoring? Well, in December 2020, a patent was issued that described the creation of a conversational chatbot of a specific person. Specifically, this invention allows the creating of a virtual individual based on their writings, conversations, and images. You can create and interact with a chatbot that looks and thinks and acts and talks like the virtual identity that you identified. Well, again, this is wonderful because you can create accurate behavioral modeling for when it should be done. But this is assuming you're monitoring and you're creating the right individual, model for the right individual. A racist might do something differently. Who would they interact with? What ideology might that virtual individual tout? Who can and should govern such technology? What laws should apply? Well, I don't know the answer, but I do know that we better find them soon. So let me thank all my collaborators whose work I talked about, and I'm sure I'm missing many, many of them, and I apologize in advance. But let me end the way I always end. I always end with 3 statements. The first statement says that I should always end on time. The reason I should always end on time is you need to respect the audience, and you need to make sure that they were told you're going to have a 1-hour speech. They'd only have a 1-hour speech, respecting of their time and effort. The second point is you must leave time for questions. And the reason you must leave time for questions is if you don't leave time for questions, the audience in the back of their mind thinks this person didn't want questions because they were afraid they'd get very difficult questions and they won't be able to know it. So that's why they didn't leave time for questions. So that brings me to the third most important point of all. Third most important point is that you should never, ever, ever leave much time for questions. Because if you do leave much time for questions, you will end up getting the questions that you don't know, and the audience will be right that you didn't know what you're talking about. So with that said, I started the talk at 10:49 my time. It is now 11:48 my time, and I was asked for a 1-hour talk. So I leave you with 1 minute for questions, and I thank you for your time.
Thank you, Ophir. Great. Let me try to put my video on. Doesn't work. Video on. There are actually many questions on the Q&A channel, right?
But there's only 1 minute worth of time, so I'm safe.
No, I think that we have a few minutes for questions. So let me start with the first question from Fabrizio Silvestri. So he said, have you or somebody else tried end-to-end graph learning techniques to classify graphs, for example, GNNs?
There's work going on. This isn't complete, but this is quick and dirty and actually deployed. There's actual work to try to do even better than we are doing now. But for now, people seem to be happy with it, and the company seems to be deploying it. So that's where we stand. But yes, there's ongoing work.
Okay. And a related question, also from Fabrizio Silvestri. He said, given that you try to predict the long-term effects of drugs, have you tried to model it as a survival analysis problem?
I repeat the same statement. This is just finished. If you looked at the last reference, it actually says March 2021. And it's actually March 20th of 2021 or something of that nature. So there's still ongoing work. We have collaborators that will be at NIH that will continue working on it. We hope the collaborators are still in Taiwan working on it. The problem we generally have is access to data and who is allowed to access the data. And that's why I actually tried to get a group in Italy to work on this about 2-3 years ago. But so far, I've not gotten any takers. So maybe this talk will motivate some of the people in that group to actually work on such problems.
Okay, another question from Ting Su.
Not from Fabrizio Silvestri?
No, this is from another person. So she's asking about the Taiwanese use case that you presented earlier. So she said, how do you deal with the case where patients have been prescribed both traditional drugs and modern drugs, right, in their historical, let's say, medical history, essentially? And how do you deal with confounding variables, essentially, like the fact that they may have taken other medicine or other traditional medicine?
So indeed, we only go based on the medical records that they have. We only go with what's recorded in this national database. And we just run it with that assumption is the only thing we've got. Obviously, it's going to be wrong. And we don't ever expect to have perfect precision or accuracy. The question is there a tool that the doctor can use to give the doctor some guidance? And this tool, both in Taiwan and now being developed in the UK, for the UK actually, with that target, seems to work. Again, our problem is we are only as good as the data is. We try to get as close as we can, but again, if you think about medicine, medicine is not called the science of medicine. It's called the art of practicing medicine. And doctors go by their beliefs. This is just yet another tool that'll give them some empirical guidance of what to prescribe.
Okay. Another question that is quite interesting from Yashar. So he said, how do you make sure that when you see headache, it is actually referring to the headache associated with the flu and not use it as a meaning for another thing in English, right? So how do...
There's no doubt, he's talking about the surveillance, I'm guessing.
Yes.
There's no doubt that that information is inaccurate. It has shown, and they've seen it, that it does work and give a prediction guideline that something is spiking. We don't know, and there's going to be a lot of noise. And anybody that assumes that social media is going to solve that problem is wrong. That, however, what it does is yet another sensor, an early warning indicator, a guideline, so that they actually can use more accurate measures, such as checking in the pharmacies what medication are being purchased, checking with the doctors, are there more commonly occurring situations. It's just yet another sensor. So even though it's going to be wrong, it's a early warning system. And the hospitals believe that they would rather be forewarned something that's not going to happen than not be prepared when something does. And that was a valuable lesson they learned early on, and hence their interest in this effort and why they picked it up.
Okay, Ophir, there was a lot of talks about ethics and the likes, right, in this conference this year. So there was a question from Duncan Lowe. So he said, in terms of monitoring, for example, someone's Twitter feed for detecting self-harm risk, how do you approach consent issues regarding alerting a health professional to the individual's risk? So how do you deal with ethical issues, essentially?
This is the easiest of the questions. And the reason being is no one monitors anything unless the patient, he's talking about the self-risk, unless the patient opts in. In the United States, there are certain population segments and certain occupations. I mentioned the military when they're leaving service, are known, and they know that they're very high risk of self-harm. They know it. And unfortunately, it doesn't matter that they know it, they still are subject to it. And people are opting in order to be self-diagnosed, in order to self-warn themselves. And they provide the contact information. So no one monitors anything of anyone unless they are actually opting in to do it.
Okay, so a related question from Richard McCready. This is in relation to using social media to detect, let's say, health outbreaks, right? So he said, even if you are able to produce effective predictive models, what types of professionals would be able to safely consume or interpret such data given medical liability?
It's not a medical liability. He's talking about surveillance on the general population to forewarn, if I understood correctly, to forewarn about the possibility of an outbreak. Children is well aware, and all these places are well aware that this kind of early warning indicator may give you false positives. There's no doubt. And they don't base on anything that they get from social media. But they do know if something spikes and something does warn them, then they go and check the other sources. The problem is people don't check other sources all the time. And as I said, public surveillance is always delayed, or almost always delayed. So the goal is for them to know. If you look at our current pandemic, we unfortunately didn't do all the right things at all the right time. And therefore COVID, while it would have probably been a pandemic anyway, the effects of COVID across the nations, mine, many others, has been devastating. And had we been able to detect things earlier and known more information earlier and spike, maybe we would have been able to avoid it. So this is just yet one more indicator. It's no guarantee, but it's just one more sensor that interests the medical professional because it's not a sensor they already are using.
And one question from Maha Al-Ankudi. So she said that apart from using symptoms to predict the patient's status or the future status, do you use other attributes, for example, the gender of the patient, their age, and so on? Do you make use of?
Yeah, the graph that I showed had gender and actually age. You can use any demographics. In fact, I simplified the discussion. Obviously, you're only going to have patients that had, say, UTI if you're going to look for UTI. You're only going to have patients that had hypertension if you're going to try to treat hypertension. So you have a lot of demographics that filter the size of the population and the patients you're considering. I don't think it makes much sense, nor do the doctors, for me to be looking at somebody that has hypertension guidance if the patient's blood pressure never goes above 110/60. So obviously there's simplification, and we do compartmentalize more. I just basically give the general high-level description of it.
Okay, and one last question from Fabrizio Silvestri.
Of course.
Also in relation to the graphs, right? So he's saying, I guess that there are also unobserved edges in your patient graphs. For example, a disease that has not been reported or that has not been detected by the medical practitioner. Is that right? How do you deal with such unobserved features?
We don't. The short answer, we have only the information in the medical graphs. This is a problem of any medical health records. It's really a problem in the countries where you don't have frequent interaction with doctors. In Taiwan, relatively, they go to many, there's far more interaction. But what you don't have, you don't have. We have not dealt with it. Generally, it's a second opinion to a doctor. And I can tell you that if the doctor gets the same result from us that they thought they were doing, I'm sure they're very happy. And if not, our hope and what we were told is that they will reconsider and look closer. Whether they will or not, that I can't tell you.
Great. Thanks, many thanks, Ophir, for a great talk. It was really very insightful, very interesting, very timely as well. I think that we are on time. I would like to thank you again for giving this keynote. And please remember that there is the closing and award ceremony just after this keynote session. So I'm going to hand over back the session to the organizers, and we are just on time, which is perfect, right?
That's the goal. Always be on time.
Thank you very much again.
Take care.